Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The thing that really did it wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone. The soft, sweet-as-pie delivery, the fake laugh Jenny let out right after, and how not one damn person around the gift table had the guts to say a single thing. It happened just as Linda was handing Jenny the baby blanket she'd spent the better part of 2 months crocheting. A soft powder blue yarn, stitched with tiny stars in white and silver, because Jenny was expecting a boy, and stars were the theme, apparently. Linda had tied it up with a satin bow and added a handwritten card that simply said, "To my grandson, may you always be wrapped in love." Jenny opened it, held it up for a split second like it was one of 100 others she had to get through, then smiled that practiced little influencer smile. "Oh, thank you, Linda," she said, almost too brightly. "So thoughtful. But, just to be clear, you'll never really be a real grandma to my child." The room went quiet. Dead quiet. One of her college friends let out an awkward little giggle that died instantly in the silence, and someone else shuffled a paper plate. A fork clinked on a glass. Jenny didn't seem to notice, or she did, and just didn't care, because she moved right on to the next gift like she hadn't just gutted Linda in front of everyone like a fish laid bare on a white tablecloth. Linda stood there for a second too long, still smiling with her lips but not her eyes, and glanced at her son. Matt. Her only son. Her baby. He was sitting in the corner chair, holding a soda can, not saying a word. He didn't meet her gaze. He didn't even twitch. Just looked down like he hadn't heard it. But he had. Of course he had. Every single person in that damn room heard it. Linda swallowed hard, kept the smile fixed on her face like a broken porcelain mask, and quietly excused herself to the bathroom. She didn't go to the bathroom. She walked out the front door instead. Her coat was still in the hall closet, her car keys in her purse under the gift table, but she didn't care. She walked to the edge of the driveway where the afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the houses and called a car. She waited there, quiet, calm, like nothing had just happened, like she hadn't just been publicly demoted to second-class family citizen by the woman who married her son. Her ride arrived 8 minutes later, and still no one had come outside. Not one person. Not Matt. Not even Jenny's mother, who'd smiled a little too broadly at the comment, sipping her wine with her crossed legs swinging like she was watching a comedy set. The driver asked if she was okay. Linda said she was fine. She wasn't. She got home, kicked off her shoes, and sat on the edge of her bed for a while, staring at the old family photos on her dresser. Pictures of Matt in kindergarten, on his first bike, in his prom suit, holding his college diploma. Her, next to him, proud and beaming like she'd built him from nothing. Because she had. She'd raised him alone since he was 7, after his dad passed, working night shifts at the hospital and missing holidays and never once complaining, not even when they had to eat boxed macaroni for 3 nights straight. She'd done it all for him. For a future she thought would include being someone's grandma. A real one. Linda didn't cry that night. She didn't scream. She didn't call anyone to complain. Instead, she made herself a cup of tea, sat on the porch with a blanket over her lap, and watched the moon rise in silence. There was a sort of clarity to it, the kind that only comes after you've been humiliated in a way so sharp and casual, you start to feel numb. Something inside her hardened that night. Quietly. Permanently. Like a layer of ice sealing over the surface of a deep lake. She didn't text Matt. She didn't call to ask if he'd made it home okay or how the rest of the shower went. She knew he wouldn't call her either. He never did unless something was wrong or he needed something. The next morning, she made a list. It wasn't a vengeful list, not yet anyway. It was practical. Measured. Everything she was doing for them now, everything she was planning to do after the baby was born, childcare, house help, extra meals, cleaning, rides to appointments, even helping cover the cost of their new place. She listed it all out. She stared at the page for a while. Then she put a big red X through the entire thing. It didn't feel good. Not at first. It felt like she was betraying some sacred oath, some unspoken code all moms were supposed to follow. But then, a second later, it started to feel something else. It felt like freedom. She didn't owe Jenny anything. She didn't owe Matt silence. And she sure as hell didn't owe anyone her time, her presence, or her love if they couldn't give her basic respect in return. Still, she wasn't going to make a scene. That wasn't her style. No yelling, no confrontation, no dramatic call-out post on Facebook. Just absence. Absence so strong they'd choke on it. So complete they'd have no choice but to look around and realize what they lost. But she wasn't quite there yet. Not completely. She still wanted to believe Matt would call. That maybe, just maybe, he'd tell her Jenny had crossed a line and that he was sorry. That he saw it, felt it, knew how cruel it was. But the phone stayed quiet. And so did Linda. She spent the next few days cleaning out her guest room, folding away the baby crib she'd bought, the tiny books she'd picked up at the thrift store, the stack of onesies she'd washed and folded with the tags still on. All packed away in boxes, sealed with thick tape, and pushed deep into the closet like a dream she was done dreaming. By the end of the week, the sun was shining, the air was cool, and Linda had stopped checking her phone altogether. Jenny was right about one thing, after all. Linda wasn't going to be a real grandma. Not to her child, anyway. But what Jenny didn't know, and what Matt clearly didn't realize yet, was that Linda wasn't just going to vanish. No. She was going to let them feel it. And they wouldn't even see it coming. The first time Linda ever met Jenny, she had a gut feeling she wouldn't be easy, but she buried it, smiled through it, and told herself not to judge. Matt had brought her home over Thanksgiving 5 years ago, wide-eyed and smitten, introducing her like she was some rare treasure that had fallen straight from heaven into his lap. Jenny came armed with a firm handshake, a designer scarf, and an offhand comment about how small the living room was. Cute, though, like a little cottage, and right then and there, Linda felt a flicker of something. But again, she smiled. Because mothers don't rock the boat when their sons are in love. They smile, and they play nice, and they host dinners and ask about careers and quietly try to find their place in the new configuration. Linda was good at that, finding her place in things. She always had been. She wasn't loud or demanding, never pushed too hard. Instead, she filled in the cracks. When Matt and Jenny got their first apartment and the heating didn't work right, she showed up with space heaters. When their car broke down, she gave them hers for 2 weeks. When they couldn't afford their rent that one winter, she quietly Venmo'd Matt $900 and told him it was just some extra money she'd come into, like it had fallen from the sky. That wasn't even the half of it. When Jenny got the job at the design firm, Linda stepped in to walk their dog every afternoon, Monday through Friday, rain or shine. The one they rescued, but couldn't seem to care for unless it was Instagrammable. When they traveled to Florida for a 2-week honeymoon, Linda watched the dog for 3 months, yes, 3 whole months, somehow, and also collected their mail, watered their plants, and cleaned out their fridge so they wouldn't return to the smell of forgotten takeout. She even helped clean their house before every holiday gathering, including the baby shower, which now made her stomach turn just thinking about it. She'd been on her hands and knees scrubbing Jenny's baseboards the day before that whole mess went down, just so the place would look presentable for the Pinterest photos. And then there was the childcare offer. The big one. Jenny had floated the idea casually one evening while Linda was over for dinner, eating lasagna and trying to pretend she didn't notice the passive-aggressive digs Jenny kept dropping about how exhausting pregnancy was. Jenny had said something like, "Daycare is just so expensive, but if someone was around to help." And then looked at Linda with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile, more like a transaction in progress. And Linda had nodded. Of course. Yes. Of course she'd help. She was already planning to cut back her shifts at the hospital, possibly retire early just to be around. It would be a sacrifice, sure, but that's what mothers do. That's what grandmothers do. Or so she'd thought. After the baby shower, though, everything changed. Not overnight, but piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly being dismantled. The first thing she stopped doing was the weekly grocery run. They never really asked her to do it, but Jenny would always forget something and text Linda with a "hey, if you're out anyway, could you grab?" message, usually followed by a very specific brand of oat milk or expensive gluten-free cookies. Linda just stopped replying to those. Then it was the cleaning. She skipped their spring deep clean without a word, even when Jenny texted saying, "Hey, just checking, still good for Saturday?" Linda simply replied, "Not this weekend, sorry," and left it at that. She didn't offer to walk the dog anymore, either. Let them figure out what to do with it when they were both at work until 7 and too tired to deal with the accidents on their new carpet. Matt hadn't noticed right away, or maybe he had and didn't want to admit it. He'd call her once in a while, short conversations that ended quickly when Jenny started yelling something in the background. "We good, Mom," he'd say, and she'd always reply, "Of course, sweetheart." She said it every time. Of course. Of course. But slowly, Linda started doing something she hadn't done in years. She started making plans for herself. She began going to that Wednesday night book club she used to always cancel. She scheduled lunch with old coworkers. She even joined a pickleball league, not because she cared about the game, but because it was something just hers. Her own time, her own space, her own new rhythm. No one calling, no one expecting, no one demanding. She'd never realized how much of her life had been organized around what other people needed until she stopped doing it. And of course, that's when Jenny noticed. The text came in on a Thursday evening. Jenny, ever casual, wrote, "Hey, our sitter just bailed for next week. Think you could help? Just a couple of afternoons. You're the best." Linda stared at the message for a long time. She didn't feel angry exactly. She felt something quieter. Something colder. Like she was reading a message from someone she used to know in another life. Someone who had never said sorry. Someone who had taken her for granted over and then turned around and said she wasn't a real grandma. She typed a single sentence, "So sorry, I'm unavailable." Then she set her phone down, poured a glass of wine, and went back to reading her book. The wine was a little cheap, and the book wasn't all that interesting, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't holding everything together anymore. Let someone else be the glue. Let them see what happens when it's gone. By the third week of Linda's radio silence, the whisper started. Not from Matt, of course. He was always too quiet when it mattered and too loud when it didn't, but from the people around them, the ones who never noticed her until they needed something. Jenny had taken to complaining in soft, rehearsed tones that masked her sharp edges, confiding in mutual friends during brunches and baby yoga sessions about how Linda was acting different lately, how she was just being cold for no reason. The kind of passive griping that doesn't sound like an accusation, but twists the narrative just enough to seed doubt. "She used to be so involved," Jenny said in one forwarded voice note that made Linda's stomach twist in disbelief. Like, obsessed with being helpful. And now, nothing. It's like she's punishing me for something. I mean, I know she's sensitive, but this is getting ridiculous. Linda listened to that voicemail exactly one time and then deleted it from her phone, not because she didn't want a record of it, but because she didn't need the reminder. She had lived that party. She had stood there, invisible and insulted, with her heart beating in her throat while her son looked at the floor. She didn't need to hear Jenny pretend she didn't know exactly why the change had happened. What stung wasn't the lie itself, it was how easily Jenny slipped into it, how naturally she painted herself as the victim in a situation where she had been the one holding the knife. But Linda didn't respond. Not to Jenny. Not to the friend who had sent her the recording with a short, "Figured you'd want to hear this." Not even to Matt, who had sent a thumbs-up emoji to her "So sorry, I'm unavailable" text the previous week, like that was the sum total of what she was worth now. A single gesture, bland and thoughtless, a reaction with no real thought behind it. The silence was her boundary, and she had no intention of breaking it just because things were starting to get inconvenient on their end. The next hit came from a direction Linda hadn't expected, or maybe she had, but hadn't thought it would be so soon. It was Jenny's mother, Sharon, calling from a blocked number like they were teenagers playing phone games. Linda recognized her voice instantly, syrupy sweet, but tight at the edges, a smile wrapped in steel. "I just thought maybe you didn't realize how much stress Jenny's been under," Sharon said, after the initial pleasantries fizzled out. "You know, new mom, new house, all that. And with the sitter falling through and Matt's hours being so unpredictable lately, I just thought, well, maybe you could cut her some slack. Just for the baby's sake." Linda didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence stretch out on the line like a pulled thread. She pictured Sharon in her big white kitchen, wine glass in hand, probably imagining herself the grand matriarch offering sage advice to the unreasonable ex-nurse who dared to set boundaries. "I'm not the real grandma, remember?" Linda said, her voice calm, even. "I'd hate to overstep." There was a pause long enough to be a slap. "Linda," Sharon began, her tone tightening, but Linda had already ended the call. Not angrily, not with some dramatic hang-up, just a quiet, deliberate press of the red button. The conversation was over. It had never really started. What followed in the days after was more silence. This time, it echoed louder. There were no texts, no calls, no invitations to stop by, no fake concern messages about how she was holding up. Just the kind of quiet that comes when people realize their usual tactics aren't working anymore. Linda went on with her life. She went to book club and nodded politely through discussions of thrillers she never finished. She bought new throw pillows for her couch and actually read the manual for her slow cooker. She took long walks by the lake and started going to early morning yoga, even though she hated downward dog with every bone in her aging body. But she didn't bring it up, not to anyone. Because there was nothing to bring up. The door was closed. Locked. She'd even changed the spare key hiding spot just in case. And then, on a Monday morning that started like any other, with oatmeal, black coffee, and the morning news murmuring in the background, someone knocked at the door. It wasn't a package. Linda hadn't ordered anything. She opened the door, and there was Matt. Standing alone, looking tired, hair uncombed, dark circles under his eyes. And in his arms, awkward, like he'd barely figured out the mechanics, was the baby, wrapped in a fuzzy blue blanket. "Hi, Mom," he said. And Linda didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him. Looked at the baby. Looked at the man her boy had become. Matt shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, clearly not expecting silence, maybe hoping for tears or anger or something he could respond to. I didn't know where else to go right now," he said. "Jenny's at work and the sitter canceled again. I know you're probably mad, but I was hoping. Maybe you want to spend some time with him." Linda stepped aside and let him in. But she didn't say yes. Not yet. Matt didn't even sit down at first, just stood in the doorway holding the baby like someone had handed him a live grenade, unsure whether to disarm it or toss it away and run. His eyes darted around the living room like he was looking for evidence of her mood, trying to read the tea leaves of her silence, maybe hoping to find some clue that she wasn't as mad as she had every right to be. Linda didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply watched him, arms folded loosely, one eyebrow slightly raised, letting him twist a bit longer in his own discomfort before finally walking over and gently lifting the baby out of his arms. He handed the baby over like he was handing off a priceless antique, overly careful, awkward, as if the baby might shatter if anyone breathed too hard. Linda took the little bundle with practiced ease, her hands remembering more than her mind did, and suddenly the weight of him in her arms felt like something familiar, not a memory, but muscle memory. Like riding a bike or folding towels the same way for 30 years. "I can watch him," she said, softly but firmly, "but not if Jenny's coming around today." Matt looked at her, clearly caught off guard by the condition, but not stupid enough to argue. He nodded, shoved his hands in his pockets, and said, Yeah, that's fine." He stayed for a few minutes, awkwardly fiddling with his phone and making small talk about gas prices and traffic, none of which landed. Linda barely responded, too focused on the baby's little fingers curling around hers, the soft coos, the slight scent of baby shampoo and something like warm milk. After another stretch of silence, Matt finally stood and said he'd be back in a few hours. Linda didn't ask where he was going, and he didn't offer. For the next 4 hours, Linda gave herself completely to the baby. She rocked him and sang to him and laid him on the soft blanket she kept in the guest room, the one she'd once hoped would be a nursery. She fed him the bottle Matt had brought, burped him over her shoulder, and even changed a diaper, laughing to herself at how fast those instincts returned, like no time had passed at all. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own family. She felt real. When Matt returned later, there was a different look on his face. Not relief exactly, but something close. Maybe respect. Maybe realization. He stepped into the room, glanced at the baby sleeping peacefully in the bassinet, then looked at Linda with a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen since before he got married. "He seems happy," Matt said, almost like it surprised him. Linda nodded. Babies know when they're safe. There was another stretch of quiet. This one wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. He scratched the back of his neck, looked toward the door, then turned back and asked, "Would you be available next week? Same time?" She took her time answering, straightening the blanket over the sleeping baby's chest and brushing a tiny strand of hair from his forehead. Finally, she looked up at her son and said, "We'll see." No promises. No guarantees. Because this time, she wasn't rushing in to fill the gap. This time, she wasn't going to let guilt or obligation tie her down to a life of thankless babysitting and casual disrespect. If they wanted her in their lives, it wouldn't be just when things were convenient or falling apart. It would be because they finally understood what it meant to value someone, really value them, not just as a backup plan or a stand-in, but as a person. Matt nodded, like he understood, even if he didn't like it. He packed up the baby, kissed Linda on the cheek, something he hadn't done in a long time, and left with a quiet, "Thanks, Mom," that hung in the air for a long time after the door shut. Linda sat on the couch for a while after that, listening to the silence settle back into the house. She should have felt sad, maybe even bitter, but she didn't. She felt calm, grounded, like she'd just passed a test she hadn't studied for but had aced anyway. Later that night, as she was finishing a leftover bowl of soup and flipping through the TV channels without really watching anything, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw Jenny's name flashing, followed by a preview of the message. "Hey Linda, I just wanted to say I'm really sorry if..." Linda rolled her eyes before even opening the message. She clicked in and saw a wall of text. Paragraph after paragraph of flowery language and half-hearted attempts at contrition, the kind of apology that was more about optics than remorse. There were phrases like, "If I said anything that upset you," and "just want what's best for the baby," and the cherry on top, "I know we don't always see eye to eye, but you're important to Matt and I, and we'd love to move forward as a family." Linda stared at the screen for a long time. There was no mention of the exact words that had cut her like a knife. No direct acknowledgement of the insult. No ownership. Just a long, looping statement that tried to paint over the rot with a coat of pastel paint. She didn't reply. Not that night. Not the next morning either. Because something about it felt off, not just in the words, but in the timing, like someone had finally told Jenny that things were slipping out of her control. Like maybe Sharon had called again, or maybe Matt had gone home and said something that made her panic. Whatever the reason, Linda wasn't biting. Let her sweat a little. Let her wonder if silence meant the bridge had already burned, or if it was still standing but she wasn't invited to cross. Let her sit in the same quiet Linda had been sitting in for weeks, see how it felt when the cold wind blew from the other side. And next time they needed something, maybe they'd ask themselves if Linda would say yes. Because up to now, she'd said yes one too many times. And the answer was about to change. It started with a phone call that wasn't supposed to feel like a trap, but Linda knew from the moment she saw Jenny's name flash across the screen that whatever came next would be yet another ask dressed up in sweetened language and half-hearted charm. She let it ring twice before answering, not because she needed time to prepare, but because she wanted Jenny to wonder if she'd pick up at all. When she finally said hello, her voice was calm, not unkind, but clipped just enough to remind Jenny that there was still distance between them and that the olive branch had not been extended from this end. "Hi, Linda," Jenny began, with that exaggerated lightness in her voice that always came off as forced, like she was trying too hard not to sound annoyed or desperate. "I hope you're doing well. Listen, our sitter had to cancel again last minute. Her boyfriend tested positive for something, and I know it's super last minute, but we were hoping you could come by tomorrow and help out with Liam. Just for a few hours in the afternoon." There was no mention of the long-winded apology text Linda had ignored. No direct acknowledgement that the past few weeks had been anything but normal. Just a return to the pattern Jenny liked best: pretend nothing happened and expect Linda to play along because it was easier than accountability. Linda didn't even blink. She took a sip of her coffee and stared out her living room window, watching a squirrel run along the fence line with something fuzzy in its mouth, possibly a bit of chewed-up dryer sheet. It was almost poetic, really, the way nature kept recycling its messes. "I'm so sorry, Jenny," Linda said, her voice light but firm, "but I won't be available. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Actually, I won't be available for the next 5 years." There was a pause on the other end that stretched out too long to be anything but stunned silence. Linda let it sit. "Wait," Jenny finally said, the veneer cracking just slightly. 5 years? "Yes," Linda replied. "I've made other plans." It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a tantrum or a punishment or some guilt-soaked reaction. It was, for the first time in a very long time, Linda choosing herself first. She had spent the past month quietly enrolling in programs, confirming dates, filling out applications. In a few weeks, she'd start part-time volunteer work at a literacy center helping adults get their GEDs. In the summer, she'd signed up to help at a community garden downtown, and in the fall, she'd be going on a travel program for single retirees that took her to 5 different states across 6 months. Places she'd always wanted to see, but never had the time or the nerve to visit alone. And, perhaps most satisfying of all, she'd agreed to a rotating childcare exchange with a group of younger mothers at her local church, women who weren't related to her, but who treated her with warmth and gratitude and, above all else, respect. One of them had already started calling her Miss Linda, and her toddler clapped every time Linda walked through the door. Jenny tried to recover on the call, tossing out a week. "Well, that's a lot of plans," but Linda could hear the indignation bubbling underneath. It was the sound of someone realizing that the assumption of unlimited access had expired. "I wish you the best with Liam," Linda said softly, and then added, "Truly. But I'm done rearranging my life around people who don't value it." Jenny didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was tight, small. "So that's it? You're just out?" Linda considered the question carefully. "I'm not out, Jenny. I'm just no longer available on your terms." She ended the call before anything else could be said. That night, Linda slept better than she had in weeks. There was something deeply cleansing about making a decision that no longer begged for anyone's approval. She didn't need Matt to understand it. She didn't need Jenny to accept it. And she sure as hell didn't need validation from people who once told her, to her face, that she wasn't a real grandma. The next day, her mailbox held a card addressed in Jenny's familiar cursive. Inside was a short message scrawled in dark ink. "We understand you're busy, but Liam misses you. Please let us know if anything changes. Jenny and Matt." There was a printed photo tucked inside, Liam, grinning in a high chair, face smeared with something green. Linda traced his face with her finger for just a second before sliding the photo into the back of a drawer, along with a small collection of baby shower cards, hospital bracelets, and receipts for things she no longer intended to give. Later that afternoon, she opened her laptop, pulled up a spreadsheet she'd been quietly working on, and double-checked the balance on the savings account she'd originally set aside for Liam. It had been a small cushion at first, just a few hundred here and there, but over time it had grown. A bit from her paycheck. A bit from a CD that had matured. A bit from the refund she got after canceling the baby proofing service she was going to surprise them with. In total, it was just over $12,000. And it wasn't going to Jenny. Instead, Linda had redirected the funds into a scholarship trust in her own name, accessible in the year Liam turned 18. A simple stipulation had been added. It could only be used by the grandchild of Linda Myers, with written consent from both biological parents or a legal guardian. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't bitter. It was simply her way of saying, "You don't get me now, not when it's convenient, but maybe, one day, he will. Maybe when he's old enough to ask questions. Maybe when he wants to know why he doesn't remember his grandmother's house, but still gets a check every year toward college. Maybe then, he'll ask Jenny what happened. And maybe she'll finally have to answer." Linda closed her laptop, grabbed her keys, and headed out the door. The weather was crisp, the air cool with that perfect early fall bite, and the sound of distant kids playing echoed from the park down the street. She wasn't walking toward the past anymore. She was walking into something new. Something entirely hers. And for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't look back.